I am Kate Derrick. I am the Director of Communications at Complete College America, and we're thrilled to have this discussion today about the landscape of higher education media and how we as higher education practitioners and professionals and leaders can really think about what is the perspective of reporters who are covering higher education, and how do we better share our stories, our data, our challenges, our successes, our experiences, and our hopes about higher education with the folks who are writing about it and sharing it with the world at large. And I will say I'm a communications director. To some extent, I'm rare as a communications director because I'm not a former reporter, but I am someone who's worked in higher ed for a long time. I've also worked in politics, and surprisingly still have a very good relationship with the media, even despite I worked for a governor who was a very pro-higher education governor, and I always appreciated the media that held us accountable. It was really critical to have reporters asking us very tough questions, and we knew that when we were getting tough questions, it's because we needed to be asked those questions, and we were grateful for that. But we also were able to tell a lot of good stories that wouldn't have otherwise reached people, and I was really grateful for the relationships that we had. And so we're really proud to have our panelists here today who are all experts on higher education and write about it and share that information with the world. So first we have Scott Carlson, a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, who explores where higher education is headed. And since 1999, he's covered a range of issues for the publication: college management and finance, facilities, campus planning, energy, sustainability, libraries, everybody loves libraries, workforce development, and the value of a college degree. He is also the author of a new book released earlier this year, Hacking College: Why the Major Doesn't Matter and What Really Does. So
I'm contractually obligated to hold it up at every public appearance.
That's right, and you can buy it, I presume you can buy it online. Great. That's our late night talk show host pitch for Scott's book, which is actually really fantastic if you've not had a chance to check it out. Then we have Kurt Carapezza, who is the managing editor and correspondent for higher education at GBH News, based out of Boston. He also co-hosts the podcast College Uncovered, where he discusses how colleges and universities really work. And we're all interested in that question because sometimes we, as higher education professionals, aren't entirely sure how universities really work. But he provides information to students and their parents about what they need to know before they make one of the most important decisions of their life, which is whether and where to go to college. That's something that we all, of course, work very closely on as well. And then we have Johanna Alonso, who has been the student life reporter for Inside Higher Ed since September 2022. And she previously worked as a business reporter for the Daily Record, and she is a graduate right here in Baltimore of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with a bachelor's degree in English literature and communication studies. So we have a hometown hero with us today, so thank you, Johanna. So we're so grateful to have all three of you here joining us today and sharing your perspective. And I think we've seen higher education, it's been in flux, I think, since it really began in earnest and became broadly available to Americans, but I think the past few years especially. We've seen shrinking enrollments, we've seen financial strain at institutions, public and private, and there's a national debate over whether college is worth it. And the stories dominating the headline about higher education look incredibly different than they did 5 years ago. They look different than they did even a year ago at this point. And so at the same time, journalists are also, like many higher education practitioners, you're being asked to do more with less. And so as we're really in this place where we're making information more accessible to people, but also somewhat constrained in how we gather that information. So I'd love to hear from each of you about how the focus of higher education reporting has evolved over the past few years, in general and from your specific perspective. We'll start with Scott.
Okay. I would just sort of say generally, I think there's been a lot more focus on what's the ROI of the college experience, what are the students getting out of it, what are you getting at the end of that, much more than there was in the past, and I think this is a trend that has been building since the Great Recession of 2008. That was when there was really this focus that came on. You remember there was this dearth of hiring for college graduates that followed on to that. And so whenever that comes around, there's this questioning of, well, what's this all about? Like, is this worth it? What are we doing here? Should we be sending everyone to college, you know? And that it's cyclical to some extent, but you see that because of the cost of college and because of other things, there's this accelerating pattern of that happening more and more. So to the point where now we're really questioning, like, what is this thing that we've created for a certain kind of economy, for a certain kind of environment? Is that now going through a slow but really substantive change for what it's going to be 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't have the institutional experience that Scott has necessarily. I've been on the beat for about just over 10 years. We launched the desk in 2012 at GBH. At the time, it was the only broadcast desk focused solely on higher ed. The landscape has become a little more crowded since then, I think, because there's demand for this, right? People want to cover this industry. I always describe higher ed as a very opaque industry that affects all of us. We have research at GBH that shows 2/3 of our listeners in Boston and New England have some kind of connection to a college. They either work at one, they went to one of the schools, their neighbor works at one, they live next to one. So there's a huge demand for this. I always remind people that before we launched the desk at GBH, I can't speak for everyone, because you guys work for trade magazines and trade newspapers, but in broadcast at least, in Boston, like most of our stories before 2012, the higher ed stories were Harvard and MIT were in the headline, and it was already on A1 at the Globe. And so my mission is to run in the opposite direction when Ellen Garber sneezes. I don't want to get sucked into the Death Star gravitational pull that's Harvard. Don't get me wrong, we do cover it, and it's representative of the industry, but it's symbolic of the industry, but it's kind of representative of nothing at this point. And so I kind of view me and my small team in this, in our Stormtrooper, trying to cover community colleges where 40% of people in this country go to college, right? And for my audience, they need to be constantly reminded of that because they're highly educated. They went to one of these 4-year schools. In my newsroom, the vast majority of people went to 4-year and public and private selective schools. So we really try to do more stories about the rest of higher ed. So I've been doing a lot of reporting about AI. I could easily do all of my reporting at MIT. Instead, we turned to Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, which, to be honest, I can't remember the last time I did a story about that school or the Boston Globe. And so there's so many schools in Boston. We try to get out of the region too. We've gone to Montana, Germany, Ohio. After Trump was elected the first time in 2016, we went to Ohio and reported there. So I'm always looking for stories outside of New England as well. But I think, there's so much focus on this. I mean, I don't know what it was like in 1999, but it's rare, like higher ed's in the news every day now, right, with the Trump administration. And we kind of treat that in our newscast, but we're more interested in the broader feature trend pieces.
Yeah, well, I have 3 years under my belt, so a little less than either of my two fellow panelists. But obviously there's been huge changes even just in those 3 years. When I started out, anti-DEI bills and closures, we tried to write about every one that happened because they were shocking and rare. And now we certainly don't do that. We try to, follow trends if we can, but if we wrote about every single one, we would have very little room for anything else. Although shout out, of course, to the Chronicle that has an amazing tracker that is keeping up with all of that. Much like what Kirk just said, there has been, higher ed is in the news every day, and with that, I think, comes that the general public is hearing more about higher ed and sides of higher ed that they may have never heard about before, things like academic freedom, that I just think were not in the general public's vocabulary until very recently. And to some extent, that's been interesting because I think that some members of the general public have sort of come to care about these issues and be on the side of higher ed that might not have been thinking about it as much in the past as well. But I think it's changed, the Trump administration has changed how the general public is thinking about higher ed in a really major way. I think a lot of people are more sympathetic than they might have been. I'm sure on the other side also, there are people hearing about these issues being like, what? Professors could do whatever they want? And I didn't know about that before. But yeah, it's been obviously a really interesting time. It's been a time where it's been harder than when I started 3 years ago to parse what we should be writing about and to dig out of the Trump hole to focus on issues that are not directly related to the administration, or at least, in some ways every single thing is, but things that are not connected to, a current action or whatever. So it's been really interesting.
And I think it's so interesting to hear that is impacting you as well as higher education reporters, because that's something you hear across the media landscape right now is there's so much happening with the current federal administration that how do you determine what do you actually cover and beyond what's happening with the administration? Because, of course, what was happening in the broader world has not changed. It's just now there's this onslaught of additional information coming in, and I think that's especially true for higher education right now with all of these changes that are coming down, with changes to the U.S. Department of Education, changes that are happening around things like Workforce Pell and, of course, the DEI components. And I'd be curious to hear that, of course, that landscape has changed dramatically. So what stories are resonating with your audiences? Is it those stories around what's happening at the federal with the presidential administration, or are they more interested in hearing what's happening at the campus level? And Kirk, I love that you talked about it's not all Harvard and MIT, and I'm sure in Boston it sometimes feels like that, but there are, Bunker Hill Community College is wonderful.
Yeah, our, like you said, the landscape has evolved, but our approach hasn't really changed. So if you go back 10 years when we launched the desk, I'd been a general assignment reporter, so GBH sent out a press release to all the colleges in New England that we're gonna have this desk, and I got crushed with pitches. Everyone was like, oh, you need to come talk to our new dean, and we got this major gift, and come, cover this new initiative, and we're opening this new building. And I was just overwhelmed. I didn't know what I was doing, to be honest. And so my editor and I, at the time, kind of we came up with 5 themes, that we're gonna kind of cover to kind of think, what are we actually covering? So the first thing was access and affordability. Second thing was cost and debt. Third topic was new business models. Fourth was technology and innovation. At the time, that was MOOCs. Everyone remember massive open online courses?
I don't think we do, actually.
now it's AI. And then the fifth thing is, and I think the most important topic, is what I call global competitiveness. So asking the question, are we providing enough high quality, affordable degrees to remain globally competitive? I mean, those are the issues that I think really matter, in my opinion, when you cover this industry. And so when I'm writing the stories or thinking about what I'm actually gonna cover, I'm trying to find stories that are going to tell my audience something that they don't already know, something that might surprise them. My audience is a community college president in Boston. It's also my sister who lives in the suburbs and is a public school teacher and has 3 kids who are college age. And when I can write stories that resonate with both of them and don't just repeat what the Crimson already reported and the Globe rewrote and the New York Times rewrote, then I'm adding something to the conversation. So, and we do that by using the magic of public media, which is introduce people to other people they might otherwise not meet, or take them places they might not otherwise go. And so that's what I'm trying to do with every story. So yeah, we covered the Trump administration, but I spend as little time as possible covering it. Like you might hear those stories in an NPR newscast, right? And I spend so little time on that. And there's reverse incentive though, right? More people will hear that newscast spot at the top of the hour than the feature I spent a month producing. But that feature is gonna resonate more deeply with the people who do hear it, in my opinion. So I've been doing reporting on AI, and I spent like 2 hours in a English professor's classroom, and I just captured him teaching some 19th century novel, and it was kind of the anti-AI story, right? He's requiring that his students take handwritten notes, shut their phones off, don't use AI to write their essays. And more people heard that story, and it resonated with people, and I got more feedback on that than any Trump administration, newscast spot that I filed.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Johanna and Scott, I'd be curious, what are the stories that have resonated? What surprised you that took off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little different in the IHE newsroom because I do think that our newsy Trump stories are doing very, very well. Our readers, really, and I think it's because we cover hard Trump administration news, but that is not necessarily being covered as much anywhere, things that go a little deeper into the weeds of policy. Our federal policy reporter, Jessica, is just amazing, and she was at NEGREG every single day, covering it in a lot of depth. So I think it's because we pull out the tidbits of the Trump administration that our readers care so much about and might not find elsewhere, but those do actually very, very, very well and resonate with a lot of people.
Is there a specific story from those that you can think of? I put you on the spot.
I don't know. I was looking at our past 6 months and then our past 2 months of most read stories. And the ones at the very top, I think, were the ones that you would expect in terms of being very big news, like the passing of the one big, beautiful bill act, and stuff about public student loan forgiveness and all of those things, public service loan forgiveness, excuse me. But I don't know, there have been a lot. She covered the freeze on TRIO funds in August or at the beginning of September. That was actually one of our most read stories of the past 6 months. And then I did a follow on some of the impacted programs that ended up actually losing the funding and shutting down, and that were sort of being shut down for DEI-ish reasons, reasons that the Trump administration saw as being related to DEI, it would seem. And that also did very, very well. But we have a ton of stuff that is not Trump that is also doing super well. I had a handwriting feature this year as well. That was really fun to write about, just about professors saying, you're writing your essay by hand, sorry about it. And that did very well as well, because I think, looking at solutions and answers to the problems that are addressing faculty and staff at the campus level is always, going to be very interesting to those people and to outsiders interested in what's going on.
Scott, I'd be curious to hear from you.
Since I'm not involved in planning the Chronicle stories, I'm surprised every morning I open the Chronicle. So it's a great pleasure to work there, and also still be delighted and surprised every morning. I would say that I asked some of my colleagues this morning about what are some of the common themes that end up becoming popular stories. Rick Seltzer gave me sort of 5 major buckets that things fall into generally, that where 70% of the open rates have been, which has been in federal news politics, AI, college leadership, speech, and D1 athletics, and the crisis around D1 athletics. So those are the sort of 5 major things. And if I were to list off, the top 10 stories of the past year, you would find a mix of things that have to do with the position of the faculty, what's going on with cheating in AI, what's going on with conservatives and Trump and the pressure on colleges, some personality-driven stories like Kendi's move to Howard and so on. So it's a mix. What's interesting about what I've heard here is that there's such a huge translation chasm between the public and what colleges do, and how complex what colleges do, how complex that is, and how that's so hard to talk to the public about that. So if you're able to talk to a community college president and a mom of 4 in Worcester or whatever, it's a very difficult thing to get to sort of bridge, just simply because so much of this is just not transparent, even to us as reporters. And I only cover, when I think about this, I've been at the Chronicle for 25 years, but I think about my expertise in higher education, and it's in this one little slice of one little part of it. Like, knowing things about federal regulations is like a whole nother thing. Knowing the whole admissions and enrollment game is a whole nother thing, So, and how you break this down for people is, it's really complex. My former colleague, Scott Smallwood, has started this organization called Open Campus, which I think is doing really effective work. And what I would love to see is, especially under the current situation that media is in, more of this collaboration among different kind of media organizations, especially if we're able to move more of them toward a kind of nonprofit status. I just don't feel that the profit motive in journalism is really doing it any good. We've got to somehow reconceive that as a public service in this country, and how we're going to get there, I'm not quite sure.
Hear, hear. Agreed.
We do partner with the Hechinger Report for our podcast. I work with John Marcus. But the Hechinger Report is I kind of call him like the dean of higher ed reporting, at least in New England.
Some of the problem I have with that, though, is that some of that is kind of explosive journalism in a certain way, where I read it as an insider, a semi-insider,
right.
And I'm like, that's not really how this works, or that's not
right.
really the case, right? All the stories out there that are about, this major pays this much money, and look at all these starving art history students, it's very superficial in a lot of ways, and I really do worry about that, because this is one of the major problems that we're trying to deal with in this country, this public perception about what higher ed is
right.
versus what it actually is.
And the stories that have resonated, when I think about the long form pieces that we do, there are certain moments over the last 10 years where I noticed like a shift in the environment. One was after Mount Ida College shut down in Newton without any warning. Parents started calling me asking if their college was going to shut down, if their kid should go to a certain college. So we did a whole series of reporting at a podcast episode where we just asked the simple question, how do you know if your college is going to shut down? And that was one of the most popular stories we did. And I think like approaching it that way and approaching the industry that way for the public, you guys are writing for a very informed audience, right? People on the inside are reading your pieces. I'm writing for a general audience. And so I have to distill it down to its essence. Like I have to take a very complex thing and get it down either to a 30-second newscast spot, a 4-minute feature, or a 20-minute podcast. But I think asking big questions like that, or we've done a whole series of stories and podcasts about discount rates, which everyone in this room understands how that works, right? But the public doesn't understand that most colleges are discounting 60% of their tuition. Or if you're a 4-year private college in New England now, and for your first-year students, they're discounting 70% of tuition. In any other industry, you would shut down, right? That's just not sustainable anymore. And explaining that might sound explosive, but to the public, they don't understand that. They just see the sticker price, right? And they don't understand, why is college so expensive? Is it worth it, right? That's all. And I think pulling back the curtain and explaining how it works and why it works this way is long overdue.
And it's interesting you talk about the closures and different audiences wanted to know different things. I was working for the Tennessee Higher Education Commission in 2017 as their communications director when ITT Technical Institute shut down. And it was very abrupt. And they were a private institution, so they didn't work as closely with the state. But of course, we stepped in to help the students who were at a loss of middle of the semester, what do I do with my credits, where do I go? And it was interesting the different questions that we got from the more industry reporters. We would get questions of what happened,
right.
How did this happen, what led up to this, what's the state's response, how are you going to work with this? But we got so many questions from especially local TV stations, newspapers about, so what do students do now? And
Right.
it was really interesting to kind of go down both of those avenues and really see where the audiences were segmented. And they were both really critical places to have to cover that information. One, so that we understood what happened so we can stop it from happening again, and so that people can understand what institutions to look at where, like you said, even if reporters don't secretly have a list of all of the colleges that are
Right.
going to close, what signs should people look for there? And that was really interesting to see. And Scott, I think it's so interesting you brought up that parallel of the funding of media, because it's such a similar question to higher education. I think you can argue both of these are public goods, and how much subsidization should be happening of them, and is the business model meant to be profitable, or is it meant to provide a public good that may happen at a loss? And I think that's such a fascinating parallel that both higher education and media are facing.
Or just a modest profit. I mean, the deal is that a lot of newspapers, well, this was the case for a while. I haven't looked at this recently, but a lot of newspapers can make a modest profit. It's just that if you have corporate ownership that wants an increasing profit every quarter, that just is not going to work with the media of today. I mean, there was a lot of media back during Hearst and all of that was it was a moneymaker. And when I joined the Chronicle 25 years ago, it was like, wow, here's your credit card. You can travel wherever you want to. You can go, obviously that the bottom has fallen out of that to a great extent. So.
And I imagine that's very similar to a lot of people in here who work in higher education. I think other than a few of the very elite institutions who even they are tightening their belt buckle right now. I'd be curious to hear, what are the stories that you think are not covered enough? And from kind of your personal perspective, what's not covered enough? And are there stories that you wanted to chase, but for whatever reason you weren't able to?
Do you want?
Yeah, go ahead.
What isn't covered enough? I think, I guess this kind of gets at what I was saying earlier, which is what's complicated here is this, about the story about higher education, is just the fact that it's connected to all of these other things. And so you have the story of like, well, is education worth it? And should you go to college and all of that? While at the same time, there's stories on the other side of the front page that are talking about, the housing market being out of control and what's happening with, the labor market and how is it treating young people that are entering the labor market coming out of college, or, to what extent are corporations embracing that long time role that they had, where they'll take an unformed person and start to form them up a little bit. You know, these are all pieces of the puzzle, and to a great extent, what I find, and again, this is to my sympathetic voice to higher ed. There's lots of things that I would talk about where I'm like, well, higher ed needs to get it together in this way, this way, this way, right? But on the sympathetic side, I would say, I don't think that we can make judgments about is higher education worth it, or you know, what role does it play, without looking at some of these other elements in the economy that are disintegrating or causing problems for people, and how those things connect. I mean, to an increasing extent, our schools and colleges are being asked to sort of buttress a lot of social safety net things that they never really had to do before. You know, I live in this city, Baltimore, and my partner was a kindergarten teacher for a number of years in the Baltimore City school system, and the things that you have to deal with as a teacher in the Baltimore City school system in terms of just basic supports. And then we talk about, oh, look at all these failing schools. It's like, well, let's look at the failing society at some level and then start to make these linkages. You know, I wrote this story recently about what the federal cuts would do to a place like Baltimore, particularly as, you know, they make cuts to something like Hopkins, which, you know, and you're coming out of Boston, where you know all these people who either work for these universities. I mean, this is just another city in America where if there's not higher education, there is no city. So somehow we have to have this broader conversation about how all these things are interlinked. And I will step off my soapbox.
I once had I worked for a chancellor who once said that, you know, the best economic development opportunity for a city is to build a university and wait 100 years.
Right. Right.
So there you go.
I would say, yeah, we don't do enough stories that, this is kind of a cop-out, but, and reiterating what I said before, but we don't do enough stories that actually reflect what higher education looks like in this country. So if only 15% of Americans go to a 4-year residential college and 40% go to a community college, in an ideal world, that would be the breakdown of our stories, right? But I would say it's more like even, and I'm fighting against this in my newsroom, but still, like, I'd say 70% of the stories I do are about 4-year residential colleges, and only about 30% are about community colleges, or what I call post-secondary education, which is really what we're talking about, right? When we say college, a certain image pops in our mind, right? I want to do more stories about, you know, the fact that we have 15 million people in college, and we only have 650,000 apprenticeships, which is less than 1% of the US workforce, right? And that's the one thing where there's bipartisan support, is that we need more apprenticeships. So we've done some reporting on this. I'd like to do more, but asking, why can't we increase the number of apprenticeships? Why aren't there more pathways to success in the workforce? I'm doing a story right now about the Brandeis Plan. Just show of hands, has anyone heard of the Brandeis Plan? It's okay, a few hands go up, good. All right, so I'm telling people something they don't know. It's in the works, but Brandeis is just a fascinating university. Also, I have some institutional bias because my dad was first in our family to go to college, and he went to Brandeis, and it changed the trajectory of our family, right? It thrust us into the middle class at a time when you could afford an education by working a summer job. My dad worked at a bakery in Medford, Massachusetts. But what's going on at Brandeis is fascinating, because I think that's more representative of higher ed, at least the 4-year residential college higher ed, than anything going on at Harvard right now, right? Here's a school that was founded post-World War II America. The mission was to increase access for ethnic minorities and women. My dad was an ethnic minority in the 1950s, an Italian-American kid from Medford. And they're trying to figure this out right now, right? Their sticker price has soared to north of $90,000. Enrollment's going down. They've been running deficits, and they've realized that the number of international students, they can't just keep adding international students. So they're adding a second transcript. They're doing what community colleges have been doing for years, measuring competencies, right? What do you actually know? What do you know how to do? You don't throw out the liberal arts. You still gain the same skills, but let's measure it. So we're not just sending kids out into the world with a transcript they're never going to show to anyone. Right? And so it's a really interesting model, what they're doing right now. They're merging the undergraduate liberal arts programs with the graduate schools. They're under a ton of pressure to do this, but the leader, there's a guy named Arthur Levine. He's a 1970 graduate of Brandeis, and by my account, it doesn't look like he needs the job, like he could have retired, but he cares so much about the place. And I got to interview him last week. He's got this sign in his office in Latin that says, if you can read this, you're overeducated, which kind of gets at the heart of the Brandeis plan, right? Let's measure what these students actually know how to do. I think doing those stories where people are rethinking the model, we should be doing more of those, which are rather than just kind of regurgitating the same headline that Trump still hates higher education and that these schools are too woke or whatever the latest attack is on these institutions. Like we just did some reporting about Brown University responding to the Trump administration. This is kind of like a off the news story where Brown is recommitting to enrolling more veterans and students from rural America. And I just get to be a fly on the wall where these like 30 kids were in a dining hall at Brown University, flown in from all over. Some of them had never been on a plane. Some of them had never heard of Brown University before they got recruited for this program. And none of them talked about Trump. I sat there for an hour and just had my microphone out while they were eating lunch and talking to each other. They were talking about video games, the new Taylor Swift album that had just come out, and getting their driver's license. So Trump was in that story, kind of, but not really, right? And those are the stories that I think resonate with people right now, because I'm old enough to remember, like, I didn't wake up every morning and talk about who the president was. But now it seems like it's just always in our feed or on on CNN or Fox, whatever you're watching. And so kind of when we do those stories that are off the news, but still relevant, they resonate more powerfully, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I feel like a schmuck bringing it back to Trump, but
Sorry, I set you up for that.
no. Well, here's what I'll say is that I think that what I would like to write more and read more is more about the tangible impacts of some of Trump's actions. I wrote a story about, I mentioned this earlier, I wrote a story about some of the TRIO programs that lost funding. You probably know this, but one of the TRIO programs that lost funding was the only Veterans Upward Bound program in Massachusetts. And, in a really good student newspaper story about that, some of the students some of the veterans who go to Suffolk, which was where the program was housed, talked about not being sure if they would be in higher education if the program hadn't existed when they, enrolled or were interested in going to college. And it's hard because it's hard to write a story about a negative. It's hard to be like, here's a student that's not going to go because Veterans Upward Bound isn't there anymore, because that's just not something that you can write about, because that person could be any person, but they don't know they're that person anyway. But I think that writing about some of these, the tangible impacts, we wrote something similar with the FAFSA fiasco, as we called it a few years ago, where we spoke with students who had major issues getting their FAFSA done, and one that even decided not to attend. I'm rambling a little bit, but there are just so many stories we've written recently where I'm like, I need to figure out who this is impacting and how they're feeling, because when it's just the number of dollars that were cut, that's not something that means almost anything to anyone except for the administrators who might be working with that money directly. The TRIO is a big one. SNAP benefits are a huge one, and healthcare as well. All of these things are impacting thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of students in every state. But it's hard because we're also living in a time where all sorts of people are more reluctant to talk to the media than they've ever been, at least in my limited experience. The amount of people who were happy to talk with me and connect me with students 3 years ago has dwindled massively. And it makes telling those real life, on the ground stories of what the Trump administration is doing, and really obviously this applies well beyond the Trump administration. Anytime an institution is closing down, ending a major, like whatever, ending a resource. There were a few examples of like food pantries closing due to funding over the past few years that were not related to any current political stuff, but that was always the thing where I was like, I want to talk to a student, like how severely is this going to impact their ability to keep going to the school? Anyway, that's something that's always on my mind, and something that I also think doesn't necessarily come to mind as a thing that a trade publication focuses on, but I love doing it, and I find our readers love it, and I find even people on campuses don't always know exactly what consequences there are, and like how people are being hit by the actions of an institution or a government. So that's always my thing. So.
Yeah, I think it's true, because I think we have folks from all different parts of campuses and systems and state government leadership, and I think sometimes it depends where you sit within the organization or the institution of what you see as the impact, and what students are going to come and speak to you about, what they're going to share in terms of their needs, the resources that they are seeking, and that can be very different. Joanna, I think it's really interesting you talked about it being harder to connect with people and get people who are willing to talk to the media, presumably out of fear of retribution of some kind, or we've seen that happen recently where you have had people secretly recording someone, and then that becomes the story. And I can understand to some extent why people would have that fear, because it's come to fruition. I think on the flip side of that, we do, in higher ed too, have a lot of stories that we do want to tell. I think especially if they can be removed from a very charged political environment. And I apologize on behalf of other communications directors who have pitched you on stories that you're like, okay, yeah, because I've had to deal with that too occasionally with faculty who don't understand why a very obscure research paper on a really specific biology cell is not on the cover of the New York Times. And I was like, that's me, I didn't pitch it correctly. As you're getting pitches from folks, what are the things that are helpful to you, and what are the mistakes that you see as people from the higher education industry, from institutions, state systems? What's helpful to you as they pitch you, and what are you kind of frustrated when they do? Lay out all the secrets here.
To be honest, this is the question in the briefing that I had the most trouble with, because 85% of my email inbox has nothing to do with higher education. And then another 10% has nothing to do with education. I get bobbleheads, I get, the state where it's best to retire, like whatever.
The reporters are just like us.
Yeah, all sorts of pitches of things that are just completely irrelevant. So, I guess on that note, I will say that if you can just make, this sounds so basic and stupid, so I apologize if this is something that every single person has ever known. But if the subject line just makes it clear that it's not about bobbleheads or something K-12 that's not related to me, and I think they give us like a 15-character preview. So like in the first 15 characters, that's really as long as it seems like the person writing knows a thing, anything about inside higher ed, perhaps ties it in with something we've written recently. But really, anything that is somewhat coherent will stand out above all the random stuff that I get in my inbox.
Yeah, I would just say, the pitches, I would say, don't assume we're just going to stop a lot of the pitches I get have the assumption it's like, oh, you're going to read this and you're going to stop what you're doing and you're just going to cover this. That never happens. It just doesn't happen. And I feel like I usually write back and say thanks for the pitch, but like we don't have the resources to get to this. If you get that response from me, that's kind of how I'm reading the pitch that you send. It's that like I just don't have time to stop and cover what you want me to cover. I would think of it like you're pitching someone who's in the middle of doing something else, right? So I'm already working on like 3 or 4 stories right now, and I have a whiteboard at my desk with those stories. And so when I get any pitch, I usually look at the board and I say, is it worth stopping doing these that I've spent weeks or months thinking about to go cover what this person wants me to cover? Because in Boston, covering higher ed is like chasing cars. Like every day, 5 things happen that I could go cover, but I don't, right? They're mostly general assignment stories. Like you think of the Larry Summers issue right now, right? Kind of a higher ed story, but I'm not gonna cover it, right? That's not I'm covering the industry. I'm not covering individual leaders or scandals necessarily, the same way the Chronicle might, right? Or Inside Higher Ed might with your briefs. Like I haven't looked this morning, but I'm sure you guys probably wrote up a brief about Summers, right? So some successful pitches recently, like the Wentworth Institute of Technology one is a great example. I was already writing a series of stories about AI. My audience heard that, and then Wentworth pitched me and said like, hey, we're working on this thing, and I was gonna do that story at MIT. And then I said, you know what? Let's go to Wentworth. I haven't written about them for a while, and it was a great story. It was one of the most popular things that we've done recently. So basically what I'm saying is help me connect the dots, right? So I do have people in the industry who represent colleges where I'll say like, hey, I'm working on this thing about veterans. Can you tell me who's doing like work on this? And that way I can drop into my Boston or New England centric story. I can mention that, you know, the University of Montana has a Green Beret as the president, and he's made it the institutional mission to increase the number of veterans at the University of Montana. I didn't go to Missoula to report that, but I just added a couple of graphs in my story, and it makes it a much more interesting piece. So I hope that helps.
Actually, that reminded me of one quick thing, if you don't mind me interjecting. But yeah, my one thing that reminded me of is pitches are very unhelpful when the person who pitched it is not willing to really be helpful. I've had ones where I responded to a pitch within a day or two, and I said, is the central person that you're talking about available for an interview? And they said, yeah, in 2 weeks. And I'm like, well, that's terrible for me.
Yeah. I had that note down too. I said, make your people available to us. Open your doors. Don't be afraid to let me into a classroom, so I can not only interview your professor, but I can also hear him or her speak in front of the class. Because that brings the story to life. Like me just quoting your press release or talking to someone over Zoom or the phone, our audience isn't interested in that. Like, I want to hear the person's voice. I want to be on campus with the person. I want to talk to their students. So when you're pitching something, like, be ready to open the doors and let us in.
I also, it's interesting being on the other side of that too. Sometimes I would work with leadership who wanted to, you know, they were like, this has to be very controlled. We have to make sure everything is controlled. And I was like, that makes it look like we're hiding something.
Right.
I was like, that raises, nobody wants that. Nobody's going to feel comfortable covering a story if we're like, you can't go back and past that door. Don't ask why, it's fine. But it just...
That's where they keep the tuition discounts.
Shh. Kirk, stop telling the secrets. It's got to be interested to hear from you.
Oh, well, when I tell, there's people who contact me to ask me, how do I, sometimes to get something into the Chronicle, but sometimes just for advice on, you know, we want to get this story into the Times. How do we figure out how to pitch it to the Washington Post? Can you help me? You know, people I know from higher ed. And I always say, well, you know, it's what you're doing. It's like being Udo and Franz, the two guys with the two white tigers or whatever they were. Like, you can play around with this for a little while, but eventually one might like bite you in the neck. So you have to. It's getting into the cage with journalists. Sometimes it's going in to say, well, we're going to plan this story and we're going to set up the guardrails such that he or she sees only what we want them to see. It doesn't always really work that way. I would say just sort of general things about the Chronicle. Clearly, the Chronicle is a very different animal from, it's more like Inside Higher Ed than GBH, and it's more like that than it is the front page of the Times or the Post. So we do have more of this trade focus, clearly. And so I was just asking my colleagues before coming on here, and I used to go across the country when I was in cities and just give talks for all of the media people within a particular town. If I was visiting, say, Emory, I would then say to Emory, oh, if you would like to invite all the other PR people, you know, I'll gladly do a talk on this sort of thing, and I would dispense this kind of advice. You know, big piece of it is you're looking for big trends, you're looking for things that say broad stories, talk about sort of the broad landscape out there. Sometimes it's difficult being at a college and seeing what you're seeing as this part of this broader thing. So sometimes I would advise people to say, if you want to pitch the Chronicle on, you know, on the story that you would like to see in the paper, it's part of the tactic might be to go to other institutions that are doing similar things and say, look, you know, this is a trend of some sort. We're part of this thing that's emerging in higher ed. So, and knowing that difference between what's more appropriate for a local story versus, you know, a trade publication type of story is crucial to all of that. You know, the only other thing I would offer that would be different or sort of enhance what's already been said is I do really feel that the stories about these regional public colleges, community colleges are very important, and that we ought to be finding ways to highlight these in media of all kinds. I mean, these are the workhorses of the higher education system. We talk about them extensively in Hacking College. Hacking College, if you want to hear a pitch story, my co-author worked for colleges for like 35 years, and he just called me every few months for a few years before I finally went to go see him. He's like, I want to talk to you about this. There's a different way of looking at college. You could come talk to me. And so I finally went to go see him. So there's a way to like wear down a reporter. But you know, in the end, we wanted to write entirely, this is why I'm encouraged by what you're saying, we wanted to write entirely about low-income students who go to second, third-tier colleges you've never heard of, simply because we want to tell, A, more common stories about what students are actually experiencing out there, but B, to show that what we're talking about is actually, you know, we lay out this method for how you go through college. So we wanted to show that it actually works, rather than these stories that you see in a lot of other media, where it's like, oh, here's a kid who went to Princeton and majored in philosophy and he works at Goldman Sachs. Oh, it's, you know, like, how did that happen? So
It's a miracle.
they love the liberal arts at Goldman Sachs. I think that kind of trying to highlight the importance of these institutions. You know what Kirk was saying. They educate such a huge portion of that college population in different ways and in new ways, different ways that are different from what's out there in most of the media.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to give that to some reporters, or give that insight to some reporters, I think is really, really important.
So what you're saying is if we just wear you down, you'll eventually write a book about us?
Well, yeah.
Hacking college too.
Hacking college too, yeah.
Well, thank you. And I did want to give the audience a chance to ask a couple of questions. I think we've got one of our team members in the back that has a mic. And if you've got questions, you have the chance to be in and ask questions directly to our reporters. So I think we've got a mic that's going to be coming up. We've got two folks up front here. Thank you, Carrie. Oh, right up front over here. Thank you. And if you could just tell us your name and where you're from, if you're comfortable doing that. We are live streaming, so.
Hi, my name's Lily Crawford, and I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University. Scott, you kind of mentioned explosive journalism, and that a lot of stories right now that are trending are stories about ROI. And I'm kind of wondering, we're seeing in the United States a rise in anti-intellectualism and stories, and just an overall sentiment that college degrees are becoming increasingly worthless. How do you think that the media and journalism in general perpetuates that idea of anti-intellectualism by focusing on ROI? And is this kind of a thing that holds colleges accountable to make sure that they are, and this is for everyone, that they are providing a quality education that makes sure that students are getting what they are paying for? Or is it just contributing to this overall negative sentiment towards, negative sentiment about college and a college education? Contributing to the overall negative sentiment about college and receiving a college education.
Is it helping or is it contributing to this negative sentiment? Was the question? Yeah. Okay. So on one hand, we've had the cost of college rising for over the past 30 years. The first 20 of that, the cost of college rising incredibly. Right? It's now leveled off over the past 10. But so on one hand, I don't think we can have the colleges griping about the fact that the public is asking about ROI when the cost has gone up so much. You know, so there's that. And the cost is, I could go into a whole lecture about why the cost has gone up, related to expansion of administration, expansion of physical plant, all of this stuff that was built into the system for competitiveness, right? So competition, once again, has not done this sector, I think, a lot of favors. It's enhanced a lot of things, but it's also created a lot of problems. So on one hand, the public is right to ask about ROI and to want something at the end of this if we're increasingly putting the burden of the cost on families and students. On the other hand, this conversation about skills and ROI, as you would, I think you're sort of suggesting with your question, highly simplifies what is this question of college all about. About 10 years ago, I did this story it was called When College Was a Public Good, which talked about Italian Americans, among others, who became white after the war because, you were allowed to go to college. Mr. Caprese down the street, his kid became a doctor, and so it's, like now they enter this class of people in society. So college has had this effect of leveling people up in that sense, and as we're pulling back from it, as we are clearly pulling public support back from it, I think we have to ask what are going to be the effects of that, and is it all around ROI, and how is the ROI happening if we're pulling back from it? So I think that has to be painted out clearly. I think the other piece of it too is that what is, to get at this deep question, what is education for? Is it really just for the job? Or is education supposed to be about, is what has made this country great in the 20th century, education that was available, still had to pay some money for it, but it was available, it was somewhat affordable, you made some investment, you put your stakes on the line to some extent, but it wasn't gonna kill you if you didn't navigate it clearly, right? You could navigate it somewhat, and get out at the end, and still it's something to point to as like, hey, I did this. And a lot of those, as the cost rises, a lot of those things are disintegrating, and it shifts more toward like, well, what are the skills? What's the outcome? So, you're asking a complex question, but these are the elements to it. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's easy to kind of blame the media. I would point the finger back at the industry and say, like, for too long they didn't focus on graduate outcomes, not necessarily the community colleges, which have a very more straightforward mission, but the four-year schools, this kind of like the college for all movement, there was very little accountability, and I think that's caught up to the industry. And so we've done reporting on like those alumni surveys that go out that say like, oh, do you have a good job after graduating? Like, if you look at who actually is responding to that, what percentage of graduates are, like, how many of you have replied to an alumni email from your college, right? Those are very informal surveys. And I think the cost function, gives credence to questioning the ROI and what students and families are getting out of this.
But you got to be careful of that data, though, because a lot of that data is just a few years out of college, and so there's all these people making these decisions about like, oh, well, you don't want to be a philosophy major or an English major. Look at what's
Right.
going to happen to you, right?
So you go into computer science, but look, that was some of the AI reporting we've been doing. It's like all those jobs are gone now. So I was featuring students who 4 years ago were saying like, oh, I'm just going to major in computer science. Like all those coding jobs have been replaced, and so now we're seeing the shift to studying AI and applied artificial intelligence. But I think, I think the media in general, again, we focus on those like elite schools all the time. The headlines, like you go back 2 years ago with the protest, I think there's a Colby sociologist who did research and found only 2% of graduates participated in one of those protests. But like I'd argue 100% of the higher ed stories on CNN and Fox that year were about UCLA and Columbia on fire, right? So I think, again, that we could do a much better job of kind of pulling back and and covering Virginia Commonwealth and getting to colleges that are never in the headlines or don't get pressed, because it's much more representative, and obviously the cost structure at those schools are much different.
Yeah, and I'll also just say that I think that a lot of people, young people and parents right now, are very, very nervous about the future. As Scott was talking about, they're very nervous about housing costs and just the cost of living. And so I think that the ROI question is on the top of mind for a lot of people. And I think it's definitely could be valid to say that it's on the top of mind because it's in the media, or it's in the media because it's top of mind. It's really hard to know. But I think that at the same time, what Scott was also talking about the functions of a college education outside of just job preparedness are really important. I'm someone who very much feels like I became, my frontal cortex developed in college. And I'm not a person who feels like I can really list job skills in a way that I learned in college in a way that really feels satisfying to that narrative. But I feel like reporting on that, I'll say one thing is that I do feel like reporting on the skills outside of, or the gains from college outside of job skills is challenging and not something that I do a lot, and I don't know what the best ways into that are truly. So if you want to talk after, I think that's an interesting question for sure.
I mean, getting the skills question, the whole conversation about skills, I think highly simplifies this whole conversation to the point where it's, to get to the point of being problematic, So, I mean, you've got a number of folks. I just came back from the CBE exchange, which is this big competency-based education conference that was in Arizona last week. But what is critical thinking? What is creative thinking or communication? These NACE competencies, and we're going to educate folks on, they're going to come out with these things. It's like, what does that even mean? What does it mean to the student? What does it mean in context? That this simplification of higher education down to these nuggets that you're going to be this person, we're going to open your brain and pour this stuff in and push you out into the world with the right major or what have you, is just, the public just has to be educated more on this idea that college is something you go to and you have to work to get something out of it. And in an environment where the cost of college is high, so you see it as transactional, where AI is there to do the work for you, where people sort of have this assumption that if you go to the right school and major in the right thing, that just puts you on the pathway to the job. Pathways is a big term, right? None of that is really the case.
Yeah, I think we've probably got time for probably about 2 more questions, and we'll try to keep them quick. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Matt Reed from Westmoreland County Community College in Pennsylvania. Also, it's at higher ed. I write the Confessions of a Community College Geek. So, hello. When I started the column in 2007, I kind of had that niche to myself. When I came back in 2025 after a brief break, I still have it to myself. I think it would do you guys a lot of good. Very few people cross that sort of blood-brain barrier. They're either totally practitioners or totally reporters. I think it would do some good if I had some competition. Bring in some practitioners and give them the perch, and let them, not just on the story of the day, but sort of ongoing. Because over time, as they warm up, they'll learn to walk the fine line between what you're allowed to say in public and what you're not allowed to say in public, which I deal with all the time. Because there are things that come to light in the course of practice that are not in the discourse. For example, dual enrollment. What do you do when a student fails a class that they need for high school graduation? I can tell you, I'm not going to write it. That's a real dilemma, right? Or why is it that the assessment that accreditors make us do is completely separated from the assessment that legislators care about? These are issues you can get to if you find some practitioners and give them a perch. So I'm just going to make a commercial. Give me some competition. It's going on.
Well, can I give you a pitch in response? This is the whole reason why I wrote this book this way, is that I partnered up with this guy who spent 40 years in the system, and so he knew it from the inside, and I knew it from the Chronicle perch, and I found that when we started working on this project together, I was like, holy shit, there's all this stuff I don't understand about higher ed that all of us sort of skip over because we're looking at the surface of it, and he was constantly under the surface going like, for example, so we did this story this was in 2024, where I went to Lincoln Land Community College and the University of Illinois at Springfield, because Illinois at Springfield had been numbering all of its course numbers at 300 and 400 level, even though it was now a four-year school. And so the students who were coming in from Lincoln Land College, which was right across the street, could not transfer their credits in, right? So, and so it was Ned who was like, you know why they do this? They do this for this reason, and here's this incentive from the department, and here's this, right? Yeah, we need much more of this kind of discussion back and forth. I talk about it in the intro. I brought Ned along on the reporting trip, and he would just sit there, and I would sit there and talk to people, and he'd turn to me and go, no, you know why they're doing this? This works like this, Yeah, I think what you're saying, Matt, is great.
Well, and I think that goes back to a little bit of what Johanna was talking about earlier. Sometimes there's this fear of people, maybe they're willing to talk on background and kind of reveal some of those secrets, but that's really hard to get people who are willing to say, look, this is really screwed up, and I'll give you the truth about why this happened. I cannot have my name attached to it until I retire or until I move to the private sector or something like that. Yeah. We've got time for one more, so we'll go over here.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this amazing session. Back in the day, reporters used to reach out to our faculty because of what they saw on blogs or on university landing pages. However, it switched a few years ago to social media and what they were, the faculty and staff were posting about, and that's how they were found. But now, I was wondering, with the current landscape of AI and AI searchable content experts, how are you sourcing your people for articles and for stories?
Why me? I do not use AI, and I don't think anyone in my office does, to find, well, I think the only thing that I've heard is that it can be very great for example, if you get back 6,000 pages from a FOIA, and you would like it to find something, and of course you're going to check that very, very, very rigorously. But no, I don't use AI to find any sources. I am very much still on the social medias that we think faculty use, Blue Sky, I guess. And and LinkedIn, I mean, to be honest, LinkedIn is a place that I've found a little bit more talk among higher ed professionals. I'm also, and I would love to talk with anyone about this because I think it's such a gold mine. I'm a big Reddit user. I think that a school's Reddit page where students are talking shit, I don't know, I'm sorry, can I curse?
No, that's good.
I know that 99% of what they're posting is completely imagined problems, but the 1% that's not has, I mean, one of our biggest stories of this year was BU cutting, freezing admission to some of its PhD programs, and that was from the PhD admissions subreddit. Someone was like, did anyone else get this email from BU? And we were the first to the story, I think. Sorry to Boston
No,
Media
you were.
if I'm wrong.
You were.
We were, because of that random Reddit post. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I'm not using AI. I just don't currently enjoy using it at all, and I don't necessarily have any reason to think it would be better at digging up an interesting person than me and my colleagues who are really good at digging up interesting people.
Yeah, I would say I'm a bit old-fashioned. Like I'm on X and Twitter for work, but I don't spend much time on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. When I'm, otherwise, I email a lot still. Like I just email professors. We can talk trash about Harvard. One thing that Harvard faculty are really good about is talking. They love to talk, and they don't CC the flack when they respond. They just go on tape, which is great, and that's a credit to Harvard and academic freedom. On the community college thing, though, like if I emailed the professor at Bunker Hill Community College, they would CC, it would be a controlled environment, right? So I go to former staffers like Francesca Purcell, who's now at the Graduate School of Education. Francesca, she's awesome on community college. And LinkedIn, yeah, LinkedIn's huge, right? LinkedIn is like the new blog, basically. If I see someone talking about something there, I'll just send them a message and give them my email, and we connect that way. So yeah, email, LinkedIn, Twitter occasionally, but not that often. And I'm not on Reddit, but I should be on there more because I would have got this BU scoop.
Just mostly, in terms of social media, I'm mostly on LinkedIn. I do have a Instagram account, but I just use it to broadcast where is Scott now in the world, so that's basically it. But in terms of contacting people and trying to make connections, I'm just a little bit of a different animal these days because I'm doing more of these bigger stories that are sort of bigger pieces that are more of a depth thing, and so there's always the connections that happen through that. In terms of finding it, I'm often I'm trying to go. I just sort of keep my ears open and whatever seems interesting. I'm a different animal though from a lot of reporters who are otherwise, they've got a story and they're trying to find somebody,
Well, this hour flew by, and this was incredibly insightful, and I want to thank the three of you for taking the time to be on the other end of questions for once and handling it incredibly well. And thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who tuned in, and we appreciate you being here, and keep telling the good stories.